Living in Puerto Rico meant being prepared for hurricanes, but Maria was different. The forecast kept getting worse, and our neighborhood's emergency meeting focused on evacuation plans. My house wasn't built to withstand a Category 5 storm. Old construction, too many windows, no proper shelter space. That's when Mike, my neighbor of 3 years, offered his basement as shelter. Mike had moved in after renovating one of the older houses on our street. He kept to himself mostly, but maintained his property well and always waved hello. His house was one of the few in our area with a full basement, something he'd mentioned was essential for hurricane season. When he offered space to several neighbors, it seemed like a godsend. The days before Maria hit were a blur of preparation. The news showed the storm's path, each update more concerning than the last. People boarded windows, stocked supplies, made evacuation decisions. Mike seemed unusually calm, mentioning how his basement had weathered previous storms. He'd even installed a generator and extra water storage. The morning before Maria hit, 5 of us gathered at Mike's house. Myself, an elderly couple from 2 doors down, and a mother with her teenage son. Mike had everything organized: designated sleeping areas, stored water, emergency supplies. He seemed to have prepared for this exact scenario, down to labeled storage bins and emergency lighting systems. The basement was larger than expected, with several distinct areas separated by storage shelves. Mike had set up cots in the main space, but there was a door at the far end that he said led to his personal storage area. He was clear about it staying locked, citing valuable collections and family heirlooms. Something about his tone when he mentioned this felt rehearsed, too practiced. As the storm intensified above us, we settled into an uneasy routine. The basement's thick walls muffled most of the wind, but the power flickered constantly. Mike seemed anxious, checking that locked door frequently. He explained it was to ensure water wasn't seeping in, but he never checked other walls with the same intensity. His movements became more agitated each time he approached the door. The first night I heard scratching sounds, not the storm. This came from inside the basement, like something moving behind the walls. When I mentioned it, Mike quickly suggested it was probably rats seeking shelter from the storm. His explanation made sense, but his reaction seemed too prepared, too quick. The elderly couple exchanged glances, but said nothing. The power died completely during the second night. In the beam of my flashlight, I noticed details I'd missed before. Fresh food wrappers tucked behind boxes, different from our emergency supplies. A corner of what looked like a mattress visible behind some storage containers. Small things that seemed out of place in a storage area. Mike always positioned himself between us and that section of the basement. The elderly couple had set up their cots near that locked door. They mentioned hearing voices sometimes, like whispered conversations. Mike overheard and immediately offered to rearrange sleeping areas, suggesting the storm sounds might be less disturbing near the stairs. His concern seemed genuine, but his insistence was strange. He spent the next hour moving boxes to block the view of that area. During a particularly loud period of the storm, I needed to use the bathroom upstairs. My flashlight caught something through a gap in the storage shelves, what looked like recent newspaper clippings pinned to the wall. Headlines about missing persons, all from our area. Before I could look closer, Mike appeared, suggesting it wasn't safe to go upstairs just then. His hand gripped my arm just a little too tightly. The scratching got louder that night. The teenage boy heard it too. He said it sounded like fingernails on concrete. His mother quickly shushed him, but I saw Mike's reaction. His face changed for just a moment, something beyond normal concern. He spent the next hour moving boxes around that storage area, the noise covering any other sounds. The generator seemed to get louder too. The storm's intensity peaked during our third night in the basement. The sounds above were deafening, but something else caught my attention. During a brief quiet moment, I heard what sounded like crying coming from behind that locked door. Mike immediately turned on a battery-powered radio, turning the volume up. When I tried to catch the elderly couple's attention, they deliberately looked away. Water started seeping in through one corner, and Mike had us all help move supplies to higher shelves. While shifting boxes, I found more newspaper clippings fallen behind a shelf, more missing persons reports, some dating back months. Mike quickly gathered them up. his hands shaking slightly as he shoved them into his pocket. When the storm finally passed, we emerged to find our neighborhood devastated. Trees down, roads blocked, houses damaged. Mike's house had survived remarkably well. As we gathered our belongings from the basement, I noticed fresh scratches on the floor near that locked door. They formed distinct patterns, like someone had been trying to communicate. I called the police once phone service was restored. The investigation revealed Mike had disappeared immediately after Maria, leaving the house to be foreclosed. When they finally gained access to that locked room, they found evidence of long-term habitation: bed, personal items, restraints. The newspaper clippings were gone, but they found more scratches on the walls, some spelling out partial words. The case remains open, but inactive. The police documented everything they found, but with no sign of Mike and the chaos of post-hurricane recovery, the investigation stalled. My statement, along with photos of the scratches and that makeshift living space, sits in a file somewhere. I moved inland after Maria, to a house without a basement. The experience changed how I view hurricane season. I'm more cautious now about accepting help from people I barely know, no matter how long they've lived next door. During storms, I still wake up to scratching sounds, though I know it's just branches on the windows. The police occasionally call with updates when similar reports come in during hurricane season, but nothing concrete has emerged. Sometimes I drive past Mike's old house, now renovated and occupied by a new family. I wonder if they know what happened in their basement during Hurricane Maria, or if they've ever heard scratching sounds late at night when the storms roll in. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. Working emergency response during Katrina meant long hours and impossible conditions. As a power company technician, my job was assessing downed lines and immediate electrical hazards. The city was underwater, but electricity posed its own deadly threats. We worked in teams, following rescue coordinates and emergency calls, marking dangerous areas for later repair. Each day brought new challenges. Streets turned to rivers, landmarks submerged, normal navigation impossible. We relied on GPS coordinates and emergency radio communications, working our way through neighborhoods that had transformed into something unrecognizable. The smell of floodwater and mold permeated everything, and the constant hum of rescue helicopters filled the air. The call came through our emergency radio around dusk, reports of sparking power lines in a flooded residential area. Standard procedure was to check and mark, nothing more. We weren't rescue workers, though we often coordinated with them. My partner Dave and I took our utility truck as close as we could, then waded in with our equipment. The neighborhood was like many others, partially submerged single-story homes, debris floating everywhere. The water level varied from ankle to knee-deep, making each step treacherous. Our flashlights caught the reflection of street signs, helping us navigate to the reported location. The fading daylight cast strange shadows on the water's surface. We heard her before we saw her, a woman's voice calling about a baby, the sound carrying strangely over the water. She stood in front of a blue house, water up to her knees, wearing what looked like a nightgown. Her hands were covered in something dark that our lights couldn't quite define. The way she moved seemed off, too steady for someone standing in floodwater. Protocol said to avoid civilian contact. We were there to mark hazards, not perform rescues. But she kept screaming about her baby being inside, and we had to check the power lines near her house anyway. As we got closer, we noticed she never moved from her spot, just kept turning to face us as we approached. The water around her didn't ripple like it should. The house showed no obvious damage beyond flooding. The door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. Many people had left in a hurry. Inside, our flashlights revealed a home that looked recently occupied. No water damage on the upper walls, no smell of mold yet. The power lines outside had pulled away from the house, but weren't actively dangerous. The living room contained children's toys scattered across the floor, some floating in the shallow water that had seeped in. What caught my attention were the drawings pinned to the walls. Crayon pictures dated that week, well after the evacuation orders. They showed a house, a woman, and what looked like rain or water around them. The paper wasn't warped by humidity like it should have been. The kitchen was even stranger. Fresh food in the refrigerator, still cold despite the power being out for days. Dishes in the drying rack, the water in them still beaded up. A child's cereal bowl on the table, the milk not yet curdled. Everything suggested the house had been occupied within the last few hours. Our equipment readings showed no power to the house for at least 5 days. Upstairs was dry but empty. A child's room with an unmade bed, clothes laid out for the next day. A baby's room with a crib, mobile still slowly turning though there was no breeze. Wet footprints led up the stairs but disappeared halfway down the hallway. They were small, like a child's, but too defined in shape to be normal. The carpet wasn't damaged where they ended. When we came back downstairs, the woman was inside. She stood in the flooded living room, still screaming about her baby, her dark-covered hands now clearly visible in our flashlight beams. The substance looked like mud, but seemed to move on her skin. She never acknowledged our presence directly, just kept screaming at the stairs. The water level around her seemed deeper than the rest of the room. Dave radioed for rescue support while I checked our electrical markers. The woman's screaming stopped suddenly, and when we turned, she was gone. No splashing, no movement in the water, just gone. The water where she'd stood was darker, like something had leaked into it. Our equipment started giving off strange readings, power surges where there shouldn't be any power at all. The rescue team arrived quickly. They searched the house thoroughly but found nothing. Their logs showed no residents at that address, no rescue calls from that location. The house had been marked as evacuated a week before. But they saw what we saw: the fresh food, the recent drawings, the wet footprints leading nowhere. Their equipment malfunctioned too, showing impossible readings. I filed my incident report, focusing on the electrical aspects, the downed lines, the potential hazards the marking procedures followed. But I included everything else too, knowing how it would sound. The rescue team's report corroborated our findings, though they couldn't explain them. The power readings we recorded made no sense given the grid status. The power company transferred me to a different district after that. The official reason was staff redistribution, but I knew it related to my report. The rescue team's findings were classified as equipment malfunction due to flood conditions. The house was later condemned due to structural damage, though I heard the inspection team refused to enter after their equipment showed similar strange readings. I still work emergency response, but I requested a position coordinating rather than field work. The incident report sits in a file somewhere, marked as equipment malfunction and flood-related confusion. But sometimes during major storms, when I'm coordinating response teams, I get calls about power surges in condemned buildings, about strange readings near standing water. I direct those calls to other teams now. The rescue logs never showed anyone living in that house during Katrina. The official record lists it as evacuated and empty. But I still have the photos from our equipment readings, showing power flowing through circuits that shouldn't have worked. And sometimes, when I'm reviewing emergency calls during storms, I hear something in the background that sounds like a woman screaming about her baby. The forecast for Hurricane Ian kept changing, each update worse than the last. My wife and I had weathered storms before in our Florida home, but something felt different this time. The evacuation orders came late. Roads already flooded, highways jammed, no real way out. We decided to stay, thinking our house's elevation would protect us like it had during previous storms. Our 2-story house had survived 3 hurricanes since we bought it. The previous owners had installed storm shutters and reinforced windows. The realtor mentioned flooding had never reached the first floor. We had our emergency supplies ready: food, water, batteries, radio. Standard preparation for Florida residents during hurricane season. The rain started Tuesday afternoon. Not the usual Florida downpour, but something heavier, more persistent. The canal behind our house, normally calm, began swelling past its banks. We moved valuable items upstairs just in case. The power flickered but held. Local news showed the storm intensifying, but we still felt safe on our slight elevation. By midnight, water had reached our front steps. The storm surge warnings kept increasing, 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. We watched through our storm shutters as our street transformed into a river. The water rose faster than predicted, already seeping under our doors despite our makeshift barriers. 3 feet of water filled our first floor by dawn. The power finally died, leaving us in a dim world of rushing water and howling wind. Our emergency radio crackled with rescue coordinates and evacuation orders, but the addresses were for areas already underwater. The water kept rising inch by inch with a steady determination that felt almost alive. When it reached the stairs, we moved to the second floor. The water followed, climbing each step like it was counting them. Our phones showed no service, and the radio only broadcast static. Through the windows, we could see other houses partially submerged, their second-floor lights like drowning stars. The water chased us to the attic access. We'd never been up there before, just used it for storage when we moved in. The pull-down ladder creaked as we climbed, our emergency supplies reduced to what we could carry up the narrow steps. The beam of our flashlight revealed the usual attic clutter: old boxes, holiday decorations, dust-covered furniture. That's when we found the photos. A cardboard box had tipped over in our rush to climb up, spilling its contents across the attic floor. Family pictures, obviously old but well-preserved. They showed a family of 4, parents, 2 teenagers, standing in front of our house. The timestamps showed they'd lived here during Hurricane Charlie. More recent photos were mixed in, showing the same family during the storm. Their expressions changed through the sequence, from casual concern to growing fear. The final photos showed them in this same attic, their faces bearing a look of horrible realization. The water stains on the photos' edges seemed fresh. A leather-bound diary sat beneath the photos. The entries started normally: daily life, weather reports, hurricane preparations. The last entry was dated during Charlie. Water's reaching the second floor now. James says it should stop rising, but it's not stopping. It's like it's following us up. We can hear it coming up the stairs. The rescue boats can't reach us. The attic is our last option. The water's at the top step now. I can hear it seeping through the sentence ended there, mid-word, the pen stroke trailing off the page. Water damage warped the remaining pages, but they were blank anyway. As I read, I noticed our own water had reached the attic stairs. It came up slowly, deliberately, each step bringing that same rushing sound we'd been hearing all night. We huddled in the attic center, watching the water rise through the entrance. Our flashlight batteries were dying, and the emergency radio only picked up that same static. The water kept its steady pace, ankle deep, then knee deep. The attic ceiling felt lower somehow, like it was pressing down to meet the rising water. A rescue helicopter passed overhead, its spotlight briefly illuminating the attic through the small vent window. In that moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Written on the attic wall, high above the water stains: "It doesn't stop. It never stops." Different handwritings, different dates. The newest one matched the diary script. The water finally stopped rising at chest level. We stood there for hours, holding our emergency supplies above our heads, waiting for rescue. When help finally came, they had to cut through the roof to reach us. The water receded slowly, leaving behind mud and debris and that distinct smell that all flood survivors know. We salvaged what we could after the water receded, but the house was a total loss. During cleanup, we tried finding the photos and diary to show the insurance adjusters, but they had vanished in the floodwater. The only evidence remaining were the water stains on the attic walls, clear lines showing how high the water had reached. The insurance report documented everything: the structural damage, the water levels, the rescue operation details. Their assessment mentioned our attic survival as particularly lucky, given how high the water had risen. The official explanation cited inadequate evacuation warnings and unexpected storm surge levels. We moved inland after Ian, far from any flood zones. The experience changed how we view hurricane season. We don't take chances anymore, no matter how safe a house seems. Sometimes during storms, I think about that unfinished diary entry and those photos showing the same realization we had: water that just wouldn't stop rising, The rescue report listed us as a successful evacuation, just another family saved during Hurricane Ian. They didn't mention the photos or the diary. Those details seemed less important in the chaos of post-hurricane recovery, just another story of survival during a natural disaster. Emergency dispatch during major storms meant long shifts and constant calls. After 10 years working emergency services in New Jersey, I thought I'd heard everything: medical emergencies, fires, accidents. Hurricane Sandy changed that perspective entirely. The volume of calls overwhelmed our normal systems, forcing us to operate additional emergency channels and bring in dispatchers from neighboring districts. Even our backup systems struggled under the load. Our dispatch center operated from a reinforced building downtown, designed to withstand severe weather. The night shift during Sandy was fully staffed: 12 dispatchers, 3 supervisors, and constant coordination with emergency response teams. The usual calls came in steadily: flooding basements, downed power lines, people trapped by rising water. Each call followed familiar patterns of panic and urgency. Until her call came through. The signal was clear despite the storm interference that plagued our other channels. Most calls that night came through with static and distortion, but her voice cut through perfectly. A young woman, calm and steady, reporting being trapped in her car near Palmer Street. Something about her tone caught my attention immediately. Most callers during emergencies sound panicked, desperate. She sounded almost pleased, like she was smiling through her words. Protocol required gathering specific information: name, exact location, nature of emergency. She provided details with unsettling precision, describing landmarks that had been underwater for hours. Her voice maintained that same pleasant tone, even while describing how water was seeping into her car. The way she spoke made my skin crawl. Too controlled, too deliberate. Even our most experienced dispatchers noticed something off about her call. The storm interference affected all our equipment that night. Radio signals dropped constantly, cell towers were down, even our hardline systems had issues. But her call remained crystal clear. She described her situation with the calm precision of someone reading a script: water levels, surrounding conditions, the sound of the storm. Yet she never showed any sign of the fear we heard in every other call. I dispatched rescue units to her location while keeping her on the line, following standard procedure for water rescues. Other dispatchers had noticed the call. Something about her voice carried through our headsets, even on different channels. She kept talking, describing the water rising in her car, but never showed any sign of distress. If anything, her voice became more cheerful as she described her situation worsening. The rescue team reported difficulty reaching Palmer Street due to flooding. Their radio communications were broken, staticky, typical for the conditions. But the woman remained on the line, her voice growing clearer despite the storm's interference with other calls. She started describing things she shouldn't have been able to see: rescue boats 3 blocks away, emergency vehicles stuck at specific intersections, details that matched our rescue team's reports exactly. Our supervisor noticed something strange about the call's signal strength. Emergency calls show varying signal levels on our equipment displays. Hers remained perfectly steady, like a direct connection despite the chaos affecting every other system. When asked how she could see the rescue teams from her trapped car, she just laughed. Not hysterical laughter, but a soft, knowing sound that seemed to come from everywhere in our dispatch center at once. Other operators removed their headsets, disturbed by how her voice seemed to carry through everyone's equipment. She described water reaching her neck with the same pleasant tone she'd used to give her location. No gasping, no panic, no struggle in her voice, just that same unsettling cheerfulness. The water level reports she gave matched exactly with the flood gauge readings we were receiving. The rescue team finally reached Palmer Street after 2 hours of difficult navigation through flooded streets. They found a car matching her description, partially submerged at the exact location she'd specified. The windows were intact, doors locked, no signs of forced exit. But the car was empty. The water level inside matched the rising water outside perfectly, as if the car had filled up gradually with no disturbance. Standard procedure for abandoned vehicles during storms involved documenting everything. The rescue team's body cameras recorded their entire search. When reviewing the footage later, we discovered something unsettling. A female voice humming in the background, barely audible over the storm but with perfect clarity. The same voice from the call. The investigation revealed more disturbing details. The car's registration led to an address that didn't exist in our system. Traffic cameras showed the car parking on Palmer Street before the storm, but no one ever exited the vehicle. The timing matched perfectly with the start of her call. Our equipment log showed her call lasting exactly as long as it took the water to reach the car's roof. I filed my incident report, including all audio recordings and system logs. The quality assurance team spent weeks analyzing the data. They noted the impossible signal strength, the voice bleeding through multiple channels, the precise match between her descriptions and actual conditions. The technical investigation found no explanation for the call's clarity during peak interference. My supervisor suggested I take some time off after Sandy. The experience changed how I handle emergency calls. I pay more attention to voices now, how people should sound in genuine distress. I transferred to day shift dispatch, handling routine calls instead of emergencies. The Palmer Street incident remains in our records as an unresolved evacuation case. During severe storms, other dispatchers sometimes report similar calls. Unusually clear signals during peak interference, callers describing their situations with unsettling calmness. The department attributes these incidents to storm-related stress and audio distortion. Our technical team upgraded all our equipment after Sandy, but they never explained the signal anomalies from that night. The official report lists only the verifiable facts: an emergency call, a submerged vehicle, no victim found. The audio recordings are archived in our system, though no one listens to them anymore. But sometimes when I'm working storms and the channels are full of static, I catch myself listening for that voice. Too calm, too clear, too pleased about the rising water. Our street was the last one before the marsh, a dead end that most GPS systems didn't even recognize. During Hurricane Michael, evacuation wasn't just recommended, it was critical. The storm surge predictions kept increasing, and our location near the wetlands made us especially vulnerable. But Tom, my next-door neighbor for 8 years, decided to stay. At 72, he'd weathered every storm since Hurricane Andrew, always refusing to leave his house. Living alone made the evacuation decision harder. Most of our neighbors left, creating that eerie pre-storm emptiness. Tom suggested we use flashlights to signal each other if either needed help. His military background gave him experience with emergency protocols, though we kept our system simple. 1 flash for okay, 3 for help. We tested it the night before Michael hit, flashing lights between our kitchen windows, which faced each other across our small yards. The local news tracked Michael's intensification, each update more concerning than the last. We both had our emergency supplies ready: water, food, batteries, first aid kits. Tom's house, like mine, was built in the 1970s, solid construction but not designed for modern storm standards. The marsh behind our properties already showed signs of flooding, water creeping closer to our backyards. The storm arrived with more force than predicted. The power died around midnight, leaving us in a world of howling wind and total darkness. I kept my flashlight ready, checking Tom's window every hour as agreed. The wind made visibility difficult, but our houses were close enough to maintain visual contact. His first signal came at 2 a.m., 1 long flash, our sign for okay. I responded with the same, relieved to see him following our system. Around 3 a.m., the signals changed. Tom's light started flashing irregularly, not following our agreed patterns. The sequences seemed random at first, but then showed a distinct rhythm, like someone trying to communicate something more complex than our simple code. I watched for several minutes, trying to understand if he needed help. I signaled back with our OK flash, asking if he needed assistance. His light immediately stopped. The darkness felt heavier somehow, more complete. Then the flashing resumed, more intense this time. The sequences were longer, more complex. They seemed to be responding to my signal, but not in any way we'd discussed. The storm's intensity increased, debris flying past my windows. Through the rain and wind, I noticed something odd. The light seemed to be coming from different windows now, moving through his house. This detail bothered me because Tom had mobility issues from an old military injury. He used a cane and rarely went upstairs, preferring to stay on his ground floor during storms. At 4 a.m., I saw two distinct lights in his house, one in the kitchen, our agreed signaling spot, and another upstairs. They flashed in alternating patterns like they were communicating with each other. I tried signaling again, but both lights went dark immediately. The storm's intensity peaked, and I lost sight of his house completely. The eye passed over us around dawn, bringing an eerie stillness. The marsh had completely flooded, water reaching halfway up our backyards. I considered checking on Tom, but the wind was still too dangerous. Through the rain, I could see his kitchen window was dark. The upstairs lights flashed occasionally, but without any pattern now. Just quick bursts like someone testing different switches. Rescue teams reached our street by mid-morning. The water had receded somewhat, leaving behind a layer of thick, dark mud. They found Tom in his upstairs bathroom, sitting in the dry bathtub, still clutching his flashlight. He was physically unhurt, but severely distressed. He kept talking about someone copying his signals all night, flashing lights back at him from the marsh behind our houses. What disturbed the rescue team most was Tom's insistence that he'd stayed in the bathroom the whole time, never using his flashlight anywhere else in the house. He described watching lights move through his home, stopping at windows, signaling in patterns he didn't understand. The fear in his voice made his story more unsettling. Tom wasn't the type to scare easily. The police investigation revealed muddy footprints throughout Tom's house, on the stairs, in the kitchen, upstairs hallway. The prints led from his back door toward the marsh, but they went in both directions, like someone had walked both ways. The mud was still wet when they found it, though the flooding should have washed any tracks away. The rescue team documented everything: the footprints, the location of furniture, the condition of doors and windows. All entry points had been secured from the inside, showing no signs of forced entry. Tom's flashlight batteries were dead, though I'd seen lights in his house for hours during the night. The investigation expanded when they found more footprints in the marsh area. They formed a clear trail leading from Tom's yard to where the water started. The rescue team's report noted the unusual preservation of the prints given the flood conditions, but offered no explanation. I gave my statement to the police, describing the light patterns I'd seen. The investigator mentioned similar reports from other coastal areas during hurricanes: lights in abandoned houses, signals from impossible locations, footprints that defied weather conditions. The official report remained inconclusive. Tom moved into assisted living after Michael. The police investigation stayed open but inactive, classified as storm-related confusion and possible trespassing. The house stood empty for months before being sold. The official report documented the footprints and my statement about the lights, but offered no explanations. The case remains classified as storm-related confusion and possible trespassing during evacuation. I still live on the same street, though most of my neighbors changed after Michael. During strong storms, I keep my flashlight ready out of habit, but I never signal to other houses anymore. The police photos of those muddy footprints stay filed away with my hurricane insurance papers, along with my written statement about the lights I saw moving through Tom's house that night. The marsh floods every hurricane season, bringing that same thick, dark mud up to our yards. Sometimes I think about Tom sitting in that bathtub, trying to convince himself that the lights moving through his house weren't real. The official explanation makes sense: stress, confusion, maybe someone taking shelter during the storm. But I still remember those complex patterns of light, signaling back and forth like a conversation I couldn't understand. Working pediatric oncology during Hurricane Harvey meant being prepared for anything. Our hospital in Houston had emergency protocols, backup generators, evacuation plans, but nothing prepared us for that night. The storm had already flooded the lower floors, and our pediatric ward on the second floor was operating on emergency power only. Sarah had been my patient for 6 months, a bright 8-year-old with leukemia. She always hummed the same tune while getting treatments: "You Are My Sunshine," but slower, with extra notes she'd added herself. Even during the worst procedures, she'd hum that melody, When she passed away in July, that tune stayed with me, a reminder of her incredible spirit. The evacuation order came around midnight. Harvey's intensity had increased, and the backup generator was showing signs of strain. We had 23 pediatric patients, most requiring constant care. The evacuation process was methodical. Critical patients first, then those who could walk, followed by a final sweep of all rooms. Standard procedure, something we'd drilled countless times. I was assigned to clear the east wing, where Sarah's old room, 204, was located. The emergency lights cast everything in a dim, reddish glow. The generator's hum provided a constant background noise as we moved patients. The halls felt different without the usual beeping of monitors and quiet conversations of night shift. The generator failed just as we finished moving the last patient. The darkness was immediate and complete. Our flashlights created strange shadows as we did final room checks. That's when I heard it, humming, faint but distinct, coming from down the hall. Not the mechanical sound of failing equipment, but a melody. Sarah's melody. Protocol said to report anything unusual during evacuation sweeps, but something made me follow the sound instead. It led to room 204, Sarah's old room. The door was open, though I distinctly remembered closing it during the first sweep. Our flashlights showed fresh bandages on the bed, neatly arranged like we'd just changed them. The floor had wet footprints, small ones, leading from the bed to the window. The humming grew clearer as I entered the room. The tune was unmistakable, Sarah's version of "You Are My Sunshine" with those extra notes she'd added. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wet footprints led to the window, then back to the bed, but stopped abruptly. The bandages were still sterile wrapped, the kind we'd used for Sarah's central line. My colleague radioed for security while I documented everything. The footprints were child-sized, with clear heel and toe marks despite the water. The bandages were from our current inventory. I recognized the lot numbers from my shift earlier. But room 204 had been empty since Sarah passed, used only for storage during renovation planning. Security arrived quickly, sweeping the floor with their equipment. The cameras had switched to backup power during the generator failure, but showed nothing unusual. No movement in the halls, no one entering room 204. Yet the footprints were there, still wet, and the bandages hadn't been there during our initial sweep. The evacuation continued around us as security documented the scene. The humming had stopped, but the room felt different, heavier somehow, like the air during Sarah's last few days. One security officer noticed something odd about the room's temperature. Despite the power failure, it was notably cooler than the hallway. The investigation revealed more details. The bandages matched a batch that had gone missing from our supply room the previous week. The wet footprints contained trace elements of the antibacterial floor cleaner we'd used in Sarah's room. The security footage showed static during the exact minutes I'd heard the humming. Hospital administration classified it as storm-related confusion, combined with equipment malfunction. They suggested the stress of evacuation and recent patient loss had affected my perception. The official report cited water damage and possible trespassing, though they couldn't explain how someone had entered a secured floor during evacuation. I transferred to day shift after Harvey. The experience changed how I view night evacuations. I'm more thorough with room checks now, more aware of sounds that seem out of place. The investigation file includes my statement and the security photos, filed away with dozens of other storm-related incidents. The hospital renovated the entire second floor after Harvey, converting most rooms to new purposes. The official explanation covers the basic facts: power failure, storm stress, possible trespassing during evacuation. But sometimes during night shifts, when storms approach and the generators kick in, I hear humming in empty rooms. Not quite "You Are My Sunshine," but Sarah's version, with those extra notes that only she knew. The security footage from that night remains in hospital records, showing nothing but static during those crucial minutes. My incident report sits in a file somewhere, documenting the footprints and bandages we found. Most staff avoid discussing what happened during Harvey's evacuation, but every storm season, New nurses ask why certain rooms stay locked during night shifts. The evacuation orders for Hurricane Irma came early, but leaving wasn't an option. My daughter Emma's asthma had flared up badly, and the highways were already gridlocked. Our house in Naples had weathered storms before: elevated foundation, hurricane windows, emergency supplies. The local news showed the evacuation chaos and recommended staying put if you had a secure structure. We thought we'd made the right choice. Emma's bedroom was upstairs, along with my home office. At 5 years old, she handled the storm preparation like a game, helping me fill water bottles and check flashlight batteries. We'd already moved her nebulizer and medication upstairs, along with enough supplies for several days. The weather reports kept updating, each forecast worse than the last. Our neighborhood had flooded before, but Irma's predictions were different. The storm surge estimates kept increasing: 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet. Most of our neighbors evacuated, leaving the street eerily empty. We spent the day securing everything we could, moving valuables upstairs, and making sure Emma's breathing treatments were up to date. The storm hit at night. The power held longer than expected, letting us track Irma's progress until around midnight. Emma finally fell asleep in my room, her breathing steady thanks to her evening treatment. The wind grew stronger, and water started rising in our street. Through the hurricane shutters, I could see debris floating past: branches, trash cans, pieces of fencing. Around 2 a.m., something caught my attention: a car's dome light, bright in the darkness. The vehicle was partially submerged but floating slowly past our house. Through our second-floor window, I had a clear view. Someone sat in the driver's seat, completely still, head turned toward our house. The light illuminated a woman in what looked like a blue dress, soaked through. The car moved with the floodwater, but the woman's position never changed. She remained perfectly still, watching our house as the vehicle drifted by. The dome light shouldn't have worked in a flooded car, but it stayed on, steady and bright. I considered signaling for help, but something about her stillness made me hesitate. As the car passed under a street light, I saw her more clearly. The blue dress clung to her like she'd been underwater, but her hair didn't move in the heavy wind. Her face remained turned toward our house, toward Emma's window specifically. The car disappeared around the corner, the dome light still shining. The storm's intensity peaked around 3 a.m. Water had reached our first floor, and the wind made the whole house creak. I stayed awake, monitoring Emma's breathing and watching the flood levels rise. The power finally failed completely, leaving us in darkness broken only by occasional lightning flashes. Emma woke up coughing around dawn. While getting her medication ready, I heard water dripping somewhere. The sound led to the stairs. Muddy footprints led up the steps, small puddles forming on each tread. They were clearly made by women's shoes, dress shoes rather than storm boots, and the mud had a dark, organic smell like river bottom. The prints led directly to Emma's room. Water had soaked into her carpet in a path from the door to her bed. When I asked if she'd heard anything during the night, she mentioned the wet lady visiting. She described a woman in a blue dress who stood by her bed, dripping water, humming something. Emma said the lady smiled at her and touched her hair. I checked our security camera footage, but the storm had knocked out power to the system hours before. The police took our report seriously, documenting the footprints and taking samples of the mud. The investigator noted that the shoe prints showed signs of water damage, but not the kind typically seen in flood situations. Emma started drawing pictures. Always the same woman, always in a blue dress. The details were consistent: long dark hair, pale skin, that blue dress. She drew water around the figure's feet in every picture, and always included what looked like a car's interior behind her. The child psychologist suggested Emma had incorporated storm imagery into her normal play patterns. The investigation revealed something unsettling. A blue sedan had been found 2 blocks away, wedged against a drainage culvert. The registration led to a local address, but the car had been reported missing during the evacuation. No one could explain how it ended up in our neighborhood, or why its electrical system still worked after being submerged. I installed new security cameras and additional lighting around the house. During storms, Emma talks about the wet lady watching from outside her window. The cameras never show anything, but sometimes we find small puddles of water on her windowsill. The maintenance company can't explain where the water comes from, since the window doesn't leak during normal rain. The police file remains open, but inactive. They documented everything: the footprints, the mud analysis, Emma's drawings. The official report suggests someone seeking shelter during the storm, though they can't explain how they accessed our second floor without leaving traces on the first floor. We still live in the same house, but our storm preparations have changed. Emma's room has extra security features now, and we always keep her nebulizer fully charged. The police photos of those muddy footprints stay filed away with our insurance papers, documenting what happened during Irma. The child psychologist suggested Emma's drawings were a normal response to storm trauma. The official explanation cites someone possibly seeking shelter during evacuation, though no one can explain how they reached the second floor. During hurricanes, I still find myself checking Emma's room more frequently, especially when the floodwaters rise. Emma doesn't talk about the wet lady anymore, but her storm anxiety shows in other ways. She insists on keeping her bedroom door locked during bad weather, and she's developed a habit of avoiding windows when it rains. The incident report remains in police files, just another unexplained event during Hurricane Irma's chaos. The evacuation before Hurricane Andrew turned South Florida's highways into parking lots. I'd left Miami early, hoping to beat the worst traffic, but by midnight, I was stuck on the causeway with hundreds of other cars. The radio kept updating evacuation routes, but every alternate path was just as gridlocked. The bridge's elevation made the increasing wind worse, rocking smaller cars visibly. My headlights caught other evacuees, families in packed cars, elderly couples in RVs, people who'd clearly left in a hurry. The causeway had no streetlights, making the darkness between cars feel deeper somehow. The radio warned about storm surge potentially reaching the bridge, urging people to keep moving if possible. She appeared between two cars ahead, maybe 50 feet from mine. At first I thought she was walking between vehicles asking for help, something we'd been warned about on the news. But she just stood there, holding something wrapped in what looked like blankets. The wind whipped her dress around her legs, but the blankets stayed perfectly still. The traffic moved forward slightly, bringing her into better view. She looked young, maybe early 20s, wearing what might have been a sundress. Her hair was wet, plastered to her face, though it hadn't started raining yet. As cars passed, she'd turn to face each one, trying to flag them down. No one stopped. When my headlights hit her directly, I saw her eyes. They reflected the light wrong somehow, too bright, like an animal's. The bundle in her arms shifted slightly, but the blankets never moved in the wind. She locked eyes with me through the windshield, and for a moment, the causeway's noise seemed to fade away. Traffic crawled forward again. She walked alongside my car now, keeping pace easily despite the wind. Through my closed windows, I could hear her saying something, the same words repeated over and over. The bundle in her arms moved again, and water dripped from its edges, though the sky remained clear. I kept my windows up and doors locked, following evacuation safety protocols. Other drivers seemed to ignore her completely. She moved between lanes effortlessly, always returning to my car. The wind should have knocked her over on the exposed bridge, but her movements were too steady, too smooth. The traffic report crackled through static. Accidents ahead, possible carjackings reported. Standard chaos of mass evacuation. I checked my mirrors constantly, watching her move through the gaps between vehicles. Each time my headlights caught her, her dress appeared darker, wetter. The bundle in her arms never stopped dripping. When she reached my passenger window, the interior lights flickered briefly. Her face pressed against the glass, leaving what looked like wet marks that ran upward, against gravity. The bundle shifted again, and I caught a glimpse of something pale between the blanket folds. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the wind and radio. A gap opened in traffic ahead. I accelerated harder than necessary, putting distance between us. In my rearview mirror, she remained in the same spot, watching my car pull away. Other vehicles passed through where she stood, their headlights illuminating nothing but empty road. The evacuation route took me inland, away from the coast. My car's interior lights kept flickering, though they'd never had problems before. The radio dissolved into static, then started picking up fragments of what sounded like a woman's voice between stations. The back seat smelled strongly of seawater, though I'd been nowhere near the beach. The next day's news covered the evacuation chaos extensively. Multiple carjackings had occurred on the causeway, exactly where I'd been. Desperate people had taken advantage of the gridlock, forcing drivers from their vehicles at gunpoint. But no reports mentioned a woman with a bundle, despite the dozens of police interviews with stranded motorists. I checked my car thoroughly once I reached safety. The back seat was soaked through, the upholstery stained with salt deposits like it had been submerged in ocean water. The wet marks on my passenger window had dried into distinct handprints, smaller than an adult's, like a child's hands pressed from the inside. The police report I filed joined dozens of others from that night. They focused on the carjackings, treating my account of the woman as storm-related confusion. The officer suggested the water damage came from a window I'd left cracked open, though all my windows had been sealed against the approaching storm. My insurance covered the interior damage, listing it as storm-related. The detailer who cleaned my car noted the unusual salt deposits but couldn't explain their source. I sold the car a few months later, unable to get rid of that persistent seawater smell. The causeway was destroyed during Andrew, rebuilt with modern safety features and better lighting. During subsequent evacuations, police patrol the bridge constantly, preventing anyone from walking between vehicles. I avoid coastal evacuation routes now, taking inland roads even if it means longer travel time. The official report remains filed away with dozens of other incidents from that night, most focusing on the confirmed carjackings. My account of the woman and the water damage is listed as another example of storm-related stress during evacuation. But sometimes during heavy rain, my current car's interior catches that same distinct smell of seawater, though I haven't driven near the coast since Andrew. Working 911 dispatch during Hurricane Ida meant handling hundreds of calls per shift. Our center had prepared for weeks, running drills and updating protocols, but nothing could really prepare us for the actual storm. The evacuation orders had been mandatory, but some people always stayed behind. Most calls followed familiar patterns: medical emergencies, flooding homes, people trapped by rising water. But that call from Cypress Street was different. Our emergency response center operated from a reinforced building downtown, designed to withstand major storms. Each dispatcher had multiple screens showing weather updates, rescue team locations, and evacuation zones. The technology was state-of-the-art, with backup systems for everything: power, communications, data storage. We'd done extensive testing the week before Ida, making sure every system could handle the expected call volume. The night shift during hurricanes was always the hardest. Visibility dropped to near zero, making rescue operations more dangerous. We had triple our normal staff working, every desk occupied, every line constantly active. The room hummed with dozens of voices handling emergencies, coordinating with rescue teams, trying to keep people calm until help could reach them. The call came through around 2 a.m., when the storm's intensity peaked. Wind speeds had reached record levels, and the storm surge was overwhelming flood barriers throughout the city. The number showed as a landline from Cypress Street, an area already heavily flooded. Most residents had evacuated days earlier, following the mandatory order. The connection was unusually clear despite the storm interference affecting other calls. No background noise, no static, just silence between words. An elderly woman's voice came through stating she needed help. Something about her tone caught my attention immediately. In my 6 years of emergency dispatch, I'd learned to read voices: panic, shock, confusion. But this was different. It sounded distant, like she was speaking through water, but perfectly understandable. When I asked for her address, she gave a house number that shouldn't have existed on Cypress Street. The block ended before that number. Following protocol, I tried gathering basic information while dispatching rescue teams. We had specific questions designed to assess the situation quickly: number of people involved, immediate dangers, medical needs. She answered everything with unsettling precision, describing water levels and structural damage that matched our monitoring systems exactly. But her voice remained calm, almost pleasant as she described her house flooding around her. The woman mentioned needing to finish something from the last flood. When I asked for clarification, she described events from Hurricane Betsy in 1965, speaking about them in present tense. Her voice grew clearer as she talked, though the words seemed to echo slightly, like she was speaking in a large, empty space. The details she provided about Betsy matched our historical records perfectly, including information that wasn't publicly available. Other dispatchers noticed something odd about the call. The audio seemed to bleed through their headsets, though the call was only on my line. This had never happened before. Our system isolated each call to its specific workstation. The woman's voice maintained that same underwater quality, but now carried traces of other voices behind it, all speaking together in perfect unison. I kept her talking while tracking the rescue team's progress. Our protocols required maintaining contact with callers until help arrived, keeping them calm and gathering any additional information that might help rescuers. She described watching the water rise, floor by floor, room by room. Her descriptions matched historical flood patterns from Betsy exactly, details that weren't public record. The rescue team reported difficulty finding the address. The house numbers on Cypress Street seemed to shift in their flashlight beams. The woman's voice changed subtly as she spoke about finishing her tasks. The underwater quality became more pronounced, but her words remained clear. She described items she needed to save, people she needed to warn, all from decades ago. The rescue team's radio crackled with static every time she mentioned specific names. Their equipment was top of the line, designed to work in extreme conditions. But something about this call seemed to affect all our systems. When they finally reached the location, the house was empty. Not just evacuated, the rescue team reported the building showed signs of long-term abandonment. Decades of decay were visible beneath the flood water. The water inside was oddly still compared to the surrounding flood, and their equipment kept malfunctioning. Their body cameras showed only static when pointed at certain rooms, though they worked perfectly everywhere else. I maintained contact throughout their search, following our never-break contact protocol. The woman's voice never changed, still describing events from Betsy as if they were happening now. She named family members who needed help, listed items that needed saving, all while the rescue team confirmed the house was empty and had been for years. Their thermal imaging showed no heat signatures, no signs of recent occupation. The call ended abruptly, cutting off mid-sentence. The rescue team reported a sudden drop in water level inside the house, though the surrounding area remained flooded. Their equipment started working again immediately, all systems returning to normal at once. The final radio transmission described finding old photographs floating in the water, showing the house during Betsy, with a family standing out front. The photos disintegrated when they tried to retrieve them. The investigation revealed disturbing details. The address matched a house that had been destroyed during Betsy. City records showed it had never been rebuilt, though something clearly stood there now. The woman's description of the flood damage aligned perfectly with historical records. The phone number she'd called from hadn't been in service since 1965, yet our systems showed it as an active landline during the call. Our quality assurance team spent weeks analyzing the data. Every call was recorded and archived, standard procedure for emergency services. But this recording was different. The audio file showed anomalies that our technical team couldn't explain. The woman's voice seemed to exist on frequencies that shouldn't have been possible through our phone system. The technical investigation found no explanation for the call's origin. Our systems were thoroughly checked. Hardware, software, network connections. Everything functioned normally before and after the call. The phone number hadn't been in service for decades, yet our systems showed it as an active line during those few minutes. The rescue team's report documented the abandoned house and their equipment malfunctions but offered no explanations. My supervisor suggested taking some time off after Ida. 20 years of emergency dispatch experience hadn't prepared him for this kind of incident. The experience changed how I handle emergency calls. I pay more attention to voice qualities now, how people should sound during floods. The recording sits in our evidence files, though it's degraded to mostly static. The official report cites equipment malfunction and storm-related interference. During major storms, I still think about that call from Cypress Street. about the woman's voice describing a flood from long ago. The incident remains in our files, documented but unexplained, like many other strange calls received during hurricane evacuations. Volunteering for flood rescue during Hurricane Katrina wasn't a decision I made lightly. As a former Coast Guard member with experience in disaster response, I felt obligated to help. The scenes in New Orleans were apocalyptic, entire neighborhoods underwater, people stranded on rooftops, the air filled with the sounds of helicopter rotors and distant cries for help. Our team operated out of a makeshift command center in Baton Rouge, using whatever boats and equipment we could cobble together. Communication was spotty at best, with most cell towers down and radio frequencies overwhelmed. We relied on paper maps, word of mouth, and pure instinct to navigate the flooded streets of New Orleans. The family we picked up on our third day of rescues immediately felt off. We found them huddled on the second floor of a partially submerged house in the lower 9th Ward. 2 parents, 3 kids, all eerily calm given the circumstances. Most people we rescued were either panicked or shell-shocked, but this family seemed almost expectant, like they'd been waiting for us. The father did most of the talking, asking detailed questions about our rescue routes and safe houses. At the time, I chalked it up to a concerned parent wanting reassurance, but his interest went beyond normal curiosity. He wanted to know specifics about our boat capacities, fuel reserves, even the shift schedules of our volunteer teams. The mother kept the kids unnaturally quiet, shushing them whenever they started to speak. The oldest boy, maybe 12 or 13, kept staring at our rescue gear with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The 2 younger girls never said a word, just clutched identical stuffed animals and watched us with wide, unblinking eyes. It wasn't until we got them to our primary safe house, a high school gymnasium on higher ground, that I noticed the map. It fell out of their bag as we were helping them unload. A detailed street plan of New Orleans with markings that made my blood run cold. Our rescue routes were highlighted in red, safe houses circled in blue, even our command center location clearly marked. This wasn't publicly available information. These were details only our rescue teams should have known. I confronted the father, asking where he got the map. His explanation was too smooth, too rehearsed. Claimed he'd found it floating in the floodwaters, thought it might be useful. But the markings were fresh, the paper dry. This was no waterlogged debris. It was an active intelligence document. Before I could alert my team leader, the family disappeared into the crowd of evacuees. The gymnasium was chaos, hundreds of people seeking food, medical attention, and information about loved ones. By the time I found someone in charge, the family was gone. No record of them checking in, no names on any lists. That night, supplies started going missing from our rescue boats. Small things at first. First aid kits, flashlights, emergency rations. But then fuel cans disappeared, along with detailed maps of the flood zones. Other volunteers reported being followed as they moved between safe houses, always by figures that melted away when confronted. The next morning, 3 of our rescue boats wouldn't start. Fuel lines cut, engines sabotaged. We lost precious hours of search time, stranding who knows how many people waiting for rescue. I couldn't shake the feeling that the family was involved, that somehow they'd use the information from that map to target our operations. As the days wore on, more incidents piled up. Rescue helicopters reported false beacon signals, drawing them to empty locations while real distress calls went unanswered. Emergency radio frequencies were jammed with static and false reports. Safe houses found their supplies raided, always in the dead of night when skeleton crews were on duty. Other volunteers started sharing similar stories. Families or individuals they'd rescued who asked too many questions, who seemed too calm in the face of disaster, always disappearing before they could be processed, always leaving chaos in their wake. It was like a coordinated effort to disrupt rescue operations, to sow confusion in an already desperate situation. The authorities were overwhelmed, focused on immediate rescue efforts rather than investigating potential sabotage. We started implementing our own security measures, buddy systems for volunteers, stricter control of sensitive information, nightly inventory checks. But the damage was already done. Our rescue efforts were compromised, our teams stretched thin, trying to cover for missing supplies and disabled equipment. A week into rescue operations, we found one of our missing boats. It had been used to ferry looters into abandoned neighborhoods, giving them access to homes and businesses untouched by the initial wave of post-storm crime. The boat's emergency locator beacon had been removed, along with all identifying markings. It was like our own equipment was being turned against us, used to exploit the very people we were trying to help. The family surfaced again at another safe house across town. Same calm demeanor, same probing questions. This time we were ready, alerting security before they could disappear, but the confrontation turned ugly. The father pulled a gun, one of ours, taken from a missing supply cache. In the chaos that followed, the family slipped away again, leaving behind more questions than answers. As the floodwaters receded, we started finding evidence of their true purpose. Safe houses that had been systematically looted, not just of valuables, but of information, volunteer rosters, supply inventories, even personal information about rescued families. All gone. It was like they were building a database of the disaster, learning our methods, our weaknesses. The final revelation came from an unexpected source. A local gang member arrested for looting started talking about a new player in town, a group that used disasters as cover, infiltrating rescue operations to gather intelligence and resources. They would swoop in during the chaos, exploiting the breakdown of normal society to establish new criminal networks. Katrina had given them the perfect opportunity: a major city in ruins, emergency services overwhelmed, and an influx of well-meaning but easily manipulated volunteers. Our rescue efforts meant to save lives had instead provided them with a roadmap to exploit the disaster. In the years since, I've heard whispers of similar operations in other disaster zones. Always a family that doesn't quite fit in, always probing questions and missing supplies. The face of disaster response has changed. Stricter security protocols, more stringent background checks for volunteers. But I still wonder about that family from the lower 9th Ward, and how many others like them are out there waiting for the next storm to hit. Living on the North Carolina coast means accepting hurricanes as part of life. My neighborhood in Wilmington had weathered its share of storms, but Florence was different. The mandatory evacuation order came 3 days before landfall, giving us time to board up windows, secure loose items, and get out of Dodge. My next-door neighbor, Bill, had other plans. He'd lived in that house for decades, outlasting every storm that came through. "Got some unfinished business from the last one," he said, waving off my offers to help him evacuate. I'd known Bill for 5 years. Quiet guy, kept to himself, always working in his yard. Never married, no kids that I knew of. The kind of neighbor you'd nod to when checking the mail, but not much more. As I was packing up my car, Bill was reinforcing his windows with extra plywood. His yard was a mess of sandbags and tarps, like he was preparing for war rather than a hurricane. What caught my eye was the new lock on his shed. Heavy duty, way more serious than you'd expect for storing lawn equipment. The evacuation itself was a nightmare of gridlocked highways and packed shelters. I ended up at my sister's place in Raleigh, glued to the weather reports as Florence made landfall. The footage was apocalyptic. Entire streets underwater, boats rescuing people from second-story windows, the coastline reshaped by storm surge. It was 4 days before they lifted the evacuation order, and another 2 before the roads were clear enough to return. The neighborhood was a mess of downed trees and debris, but miraculously, most houses were still standing. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Bill in his yard, hosing mud off his driveway like it was just another day. The power was still out, so I fired up my generator and started assessing the damage. That's when I noticed the smell. Not the usual post-hurricane mix of seawater and wet wood, but something fouler. Something that reminded me of the time a possum died under my porch. I chalked it up to flood debris, figuring I'd find the source during cleanup. As night fell, the neighborhood got eerily quiet. No traffic, no humming AC units, just the occasional generator and distant chainsaws. Around midnight, I heard splashing outside. Peeking through my blinds, I saw Bill wading through the flooded street, carrying something heavy wrapped in a tarp. He was moving slowly, deliberately, like he was trying not to attract attention. The next morning, Bill's yard was immaculate. No debris, no mud. Like the storm had never happened. He'd even managed to mow his lawn somehow. The contrast with the rest of the devastated neighborhood was jarring. When I asked how he'd cleaned up so fast, he just shrugged and said he'd had practice from previous storms. Over the next few days, as cleanup efforts continued, more neighbors returned. The stories started circulating. People who'd stayed behind during the storm, riding it out in attics and upper floors. They talked about strange noises in the night, splashing that couldn't be explained by wind or rain. One guy swore he saw someone swimming through his flooded backyard, but assumed it was a rescuer checking for stranded residents. A week after the storm, as the floodwaters finally started to recede, we found the bones. They were in Bill's backyard, partially exposed where the storm surge had eroded his carefully manicured lawn. At first, we thought they were animal remains, maybe a deer that got caught in the flood. But as more of the skeleton became visible, it was clear these were human bones. The police arrived quickly, cordoning off Bill's property. He was nowhere to be found. His car was gone, his house empty of personal belongings. It looked like he'd packed up and left in a hurry, taking advantage of the post-storm confusion to disappear. The investigation revealed more horrors. As they excavated Bill's yard, they found not one skeleton, but 3. The medical examiner said they'd been buried for years, possibly decades. The flood had shifted the earth just enough to bring them to the surface, revealing a secret, long hidden beneath that perfect lawn. Neighbors who'd known Bill for years were interviewed. Stories emerged of past hurricanes, of Bill always staying behind, always emerging with a perfectly clean yard. People remembered his obsessive lawn care, how he was always digging and re-landscaping. What we'd seen as the habits of a retiree with too much time on his hands now took on a sinister meaning. The shed, with its new heavy-duty lock, contained a makeshift workshop, tools for digging, cutting, disposing of evidence, tarps and bags similar to what I'd seen Bill carrying that night. The investigators said it looked like he'd been using hurricane flooding to move and rebury remains, taking advantage of the chaos and destruction to cover his tracks. As the weeks passed and life slowly returned to normal, more details came to light. Bill's real name, his history in other coastal towns, a string of disappearances that followed his movements over the decades. Always near the water, always in hurricane-prone areas. He'd used natural disasters as cover for his crimes, counting on the destruction to erase evidence and the displacement of populations to help him disappear. The bones in Bill's yard were eventually identified. 3 women who'd gone missing during previous hurricanes. Their families had assumed they were victims of the storms, lost in the flooding or swept out to sea. Instead, they'd been buried just feet from where neighbors barbecued and children played, hidden beneath a meticulously maintained lawn. As another hurricane season approaches, I find myself watching my new neighbors more closely. The sound of late-night digging makes me nervous. Every perfectly manicured lawn looks suspicious. The community has changed. We're more wary, less trusting. We know now that some people see disasters not as tragedies to be survived, but as opportunities to be exploited. Bill was never found. Sometimes, watching hurricane coverage from other coastal areas, I think I see him in the background, an older man helping with sandbags or cleaning up debris. But it's probably just my imagination, seeing threats where there are only people trying to rebuild their lives. The last time I mowed my lawn, I hit something solid buried just beneath the surface, probably a rock or a piece of storm debris I missed during cleanup. But for a moment I froze, remembering the sound of splashing in the night and wondering what secrets might be hiding beneath my own carefully tended grass. Volunteering at a hurricane shelter wasn't how I'd planned to spend my semester break, but when Maria hit Puerto Rico, it felt like the right thing to do. I'd been a teacher's assistant at the local high school, so when they converted the gym into an emergency shelter, I was one of the first to sign up. The chaos of those early days was overwhelming. Hundreds of people crammed into a space designed for basketball games, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. The woman arrived on the second night, soaked to the bone and clutching a backpack like her life depended on it. She stood out immediately, not panicked or shell-shocked like most new arrivals, but focused, almost determined. When I approached to help with intake, her first question caught me off guard. "Where's the science wing?" she asked, her eyes darting around the crowded gym. I explained that we were only using the gym as a shelter, that the rest of the school was off limits. She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't really listening. "My daughter," she said, her voice tight. "She was in the chemistry lab when the storm hit. I need to find her." Something about her story didn't add up. We'd cleared the entire school before opening the shelter, and there hadn't been any students in the building. But in the chaos of managing hundreds of displaced people, I didn't have time to dig deeper. I assured her we'd check again and directed her to the registration desk. Over the next few days, I kept noticing the woman. She never seemed to sleep, always pacing the edges of the gym, her eyes constantly drawn to the doors leading to the main school building. Whenever I approached, she'd ask about the science wing, about her daughter. Each time, her story changed slightly. The daughter's age, what class she'd been in, why she'd stayed behind. Other volunteers started noticing too. The woman would ask detailed questions about the school's layout, especially the locations of science classrooms and storage areas. She seemed particularly interested in the chemical storage lockers, asking about security measures and access protocols. In any other situation, it might have raised red flags, but in the middle of a natural disaster, with everyone operating on little sleep and high stress, her behavior was just another oddity in a sea of displaced people. It was on the fifth night that things escalated. The storm had intensified again, knocking out the backup generator. In the pitch darkness, with rain hammering the roof and wind howling through every crack, panic started to spread through the shelter. As we scrambled to restore power and calm people down, I realized I couldn't see the woman anywhere. The moment the emergency lights flickered back on, I knew something was wrong. The door to the main school building was ajar, muddy footprints leading down the darkened hallway. I grabbed a flashlight and followed, my heart pounding. The trail led straight to the chemistry lab, exactly where the woman had been so fixated on reaching. The scene inside the lab was surreal. Cabinets were flung open, glassware scattered across countertops. And there, in the center of it all, was the woman. She was mixing chemicals with a frantic energy, muttering to herself in a language I couldn't understand. The smell hit me immediately. Acrid, dangerous, setting off every internal alarm I had. I called out to her, trying to get her attention, to stop whatever she was doing. She turned, and the look in her eyes chilled me to the bone. There was no recognition, no humanity, just a wild, desperate focus. "It's not ready," she hissed. "The water isn't right. It needs to be perfect." Before I could react, alarms started blaring throughout the building. The woman's experiments had triggered the school's chemical detection systems. In the confusion that followed, evacuation orders, the arrival of emergency responders, the panic of moving hundreds of people in the middle of a hurricane, the woman vanished. The hazmat team's report was terrifying. Several highly dangerous chemicals were missing from the storage lockers, compounds that, when mixed with floodwater, could create toxic gases or explosive reactions. The woman hadn't just been mixing random chemicals, she'd been following a specific, dangerous formula. In the days that followed, as we struggled to manage the ongoing crisis of the hurricane while dealing with the potential chemical threat, more details emerged. Other shelters reported similar incidents, people asking oddly specific questions about chemical storage, individuals with detailed knowledge of water treatment plants showing up in unlikely places. The theory that developed was chilling. Someone, or some group, was using the chaos of the hurricane as cover to access dangerous materials. The woman in our shelter wasn't a lone actor, but part of a coordinated effort to exploit the disaster for unknown purposes. The implications were staggering. Every shelter, every school, every industrial site in the hurricane's path became a potential target. The very infrastructure meant to keep people safe during the disaster could be turned against us. Emergency responders now had to balance rescue efforts with securing potential chemical hazards, all while battling the ongoing storm. As the floodwaters receded and some semblance of normalcy returned, the full scope of what had happened, and what had nearly happened, became clear. Chemical stockpiles across the region had been targeted. Water treatment plants reported attempted breaches. The woman from our shelter was just one piece of a larger, more terrifying puzzle. The investigation that followed revealed a network of individuals who had inserted themselves into disaster response teams across multiple hurricanes. They used the chaos and goodwill of emergency shelters to gather intelligence, access restricted areas, and in some cases, acquire dangerous materials. Their ultimate goal remained unclear: terrorism, black market sales, or something even more sinister. For those of us who had been on the front lines, the experience changed how we viewed disaster response. Every new face at a shelter became a potential threat. Every question about facility layouts or chemical storage took on new, dangerous meanings. The very act of helping people in crisis became tainted with suspicion and fear. The woman from our shelter was never found. But sometimes, watching coverage of other natural disasters, I think I see her in the background, asking questions at a shelter, volunteering for access to restricted areas. It's probably just paranoia, seeing threats where there are only people in need. But I can't shake the memory of those wild eyes in the chemistry lab, or the knowledge that for some people, a hurricane isn't a disaster to survive, but an opportunity to exploit. As another hurricane season approaches, I find myself watching weather reports with a new kind of dread. Not just fear of the storm itself, but of what, or who, might be hiding in its chaos. The next time I volunteer at a shelter, I know I'll be looking at every face, questioning every story, wondering if I'm helping a victim or enabling something far more dangerous. The experience has left me with a haunting realization. In times of crisis, when we're most vulnerable and most reliant on the kindness of strangers, we're also most exposed to those who would use our trust against us. The real danger isn't just the storm raging outside, but the hidden threats that slip in among us wearing the face of someone in need. Living on the Outer Banks of North Carolina means accepting hurricanes as part of life. After losing my first house to storm surge, I'd rebuilt with every reinforcement the building code allowed, and then some. My neighbors thought I was paranoid, but as Dorian approached, making my home a fortress didn't seem so crazy anymore. The evacuation order came 3 days before landfall. Most of the street packed up and left. A caravan of cars headed inland. A few stubborn souls stayed behind, myself included. My neighbor Tom was among them. He'd moved in about a year ago, kept to himself mostly. Friendly enough when we'd cross paths, but never really integrated into the neighborhood. As the outer bands of Dorian started lashing the coast, I did my final preparations. Windows boarded, generator fueled, supplies stockpiled. Through the gaps in my storm shutters, I could see Tom's house. He seemed oddly calm, methodically securing loose items in his yard like he was following a well-rehearsed plan. The storm hit with full force around midnight. The wind howled like a freight train, rain pounding horizontally against the house. Every few minutes, a particularly strong gust would shake the entire structure, making me question my decision to stay. But the reinforcements held, and as dawn broke, an eerie calm settled over the neighborhood. The eye of the hurricane had arrived. I stepped outside, surveying the damage. Debris littered the street, a few trees were down, but overall it could have been worse. That's when I saw Tom. He was in his backyard, digging frantically in the soggy earth, not securing loose items or checking for damage. He was focused entirely on excavating something from his lawn. I called out to him, warning that the eye wall would hit soon, that he needed to get inside. He either didn't hear me or chose to ignore me, continuing his manic digging. As the wind started to pick up again, I retreated to my house. Through my shuttered windows, I could still see Tom in his yard, now pulling something from the hole he'd dug. The back half of the hurricane was even more intense than the first. For hours, I huddled in my reinforced interior room, listening to the storm rage outside. Occasionally, I'd hear crashes as debris hit the house or trees gave way, but underneath it all, I couldn't shake the image of Tom digging in his yard, racing against the returning eye wall. When the storm finally passed, I emerged to a changed landscape. The street was barely recognizable, covered in a layer of sand and debris. Houses had lost roofs, windows were shattered, fences were down. But Tom's house caught my attention immediately. It looked undisturbed. No broken windows, no missing shingles. And more strangely, no sign of Tom. As emergency services started to arrive and neighbors returned to check on their properties, Tom's absence became more noticeable. His car was still in the driveway, but there was no answer at his door. The hole he'd been digging was now a muddy pit, partially filled with storm surge. It was 3 days before the police could do a proper search. They found Tom's house empty, not just of people, but of any personal belongings. It was like he'd never lived there at all, but the backyard told a different story. The muddy pit he'd been digging in revealed a watertight lockbox, the kind used for secure document storage. The contents of that box changed everything we thought we knew about our quiet street. It was full of documents, detailed files on every household in the neighborhood. Our routines, our work schedules, notes on when we were most likely to be away from home. But it went deeper than that. There were observations about our behaviors during previous storms, who evacuated, who stayed behind, how we secured our homes. My file was particularly detailed. Notes on the reinforcements I'd made to my house, speculations about where I might keep valuables, observations about my comings and goings during storm preparations. It was like reading a burglar's dream guide to my life. But Tom hadn't just been studying our hurricane habits. The files contained information that could only have been gathered over months, maybe years. Details about family dynamics, financial situations, health issues, the kind of intimate knowledge that makes a community feel like home, twisted into something sinister. As the investigation unfolded, we learned that Tom wasn't Tom at all. His identity was as fabricated as his friendly neighbor persona. Similar reports started coming in from other coastal areas hit by Dorian. Houses left suspiciously untouched, residents who disappeared during the storm, caches of information found in the aftermath. The working theory was terrifying. A network of individuals had embedded themselves in hurricane-prone communities, using the annual cycle of storms as cover for their activities. They'd study the residents, learn their patterns, and use the chaos of evacuations and storm damage to exploit vulnerabilities. In some areas, they'd use the information to commit burglaries during evacuations. In others, they'd targeted specific individuals for more elaborate schemes. But in our neighborhood, it seemed the operation had been interrupted. Tom's frantic digging during the eye of the storm suggested he'd been forced to abandon his plans, leaving behind the evidence of his true purpose. The documents revealed more than just Tom's observations. They contained coded communications with others in the network, plans for future operations, even contingencies for if their cover was blown. It was a masterclass in long-term infiltration, using one of nature's most destructive forces as a smokescreen for criminal activity. As another hurricane season approaches, our neighborhood has changed. New security measures are in place, background checks for new residents are more thorough, and there's a wariness that wasn't there before. We still come together to help each other prepare for storms, but now there's an undercurrent of suspicion. Every new face is scrutinized, every offer of help viewed with skepticism. I've reinforced my house even further, but now it's not just against wind and water. New security systems, better locks, a safe room that could double as a panic room. The very features that made our community attractive, its openness, its sense of shared experience in the face of natural disasters, have become liabilities. Sometimes watching storm coverage from other coastal areas, I find myself looking at the backgrounds of shots, studying the faces of those preparing for the hurricane's arrival. I catch myself wondering if I can spot the Toms among them, the watchers hiding in plain sight, using nature's fury to mask their true intentions. The lockbox and its contents were taken as evidence, but the knowledge of what it contained can't be so easily removed. Every interaction with a neighbor now carries a weight of suspicion. Every storm preparation feels like it could be revealing vulnerabilities to unseen observers. The hurricanes themselves almost feel secondary to the human threat we now know exists. As I watch the first tropical depression of the new season forming off the coast, I can't help but wonder, who's really watching these storms most closely? Those of us preparing to weather them or those waiting to exploit the chaos they leave behind? Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.